Hello, folks. Today is Monday. It's June 6th, and welcome to Commissioner in a Car. My name's Dustin Zarni. I'm the Onondaga County Democratic Elections Commissioner, and this is a 2-week hiatus from Commissioner in a Car because last Memorial Day I didn't do it, but I am doing it today. And today we're talking about the end of the New York State legislative session. And a kind of a final recap on some of the election bills that were passed by both houses this year, and maybe some things that they didn't get to as well. Some of these things are waiting for the governor to be signed. Some of these things are not going to be effective until next year. But as always, since Democrats took control of the New York State legislature, they've been fine-tuning and refining our electoral system in New York and adding more ways for voters to have their votes counted and opportunities to cast those votes and register as well. And this year is is an example of that as well. They passed, I think, about 15 bills through both houses that had something to do with the electoral system in New York. And of course, there was a lot of bills that they didn't get to. And we'll talk about that as well at the end of this podcast, about some of the things that didn't get passed and may come up next session or in the future sessions. So what did get passed? Well, there's I'll categorize this in smaller stuff and stuff that we're dealing with now, and stuff that we're going to have to deal with next year, and stuff that we're going to have to deal with in future years. Those are the three different categories. So, and there are some small bills that I'm probably not going to get to, but the bills that got passed that are being dealt with by elections commissioners this year, if they're signed by the governor, are in addition to some bills that were already signed by the governor. So already signed by the governor is an absentee tracking system that the state board is promulgating that. I'm hoping that will launch in the next week or so, that we're still working on it. But that was passed in January and signed earlier this year. Of course, we also remember the lieutenant governor situation. A bill was passed and signed allowing a candidate to get off the ballot if they are indicted on a felony charge, and they can be replaced on the ballot. It wasn't just about the lieutenant governor's race. This is going forward for other races, so that was a major piece of legislation that was passed as well. There was also legislation that allowed village elections to have a pandemic excuse for elections this year for absentees. That was passed and signed earlier this year. Now there's legislation waiting to be signed that will be effective either immediately or within a few days, 90, 120, 180 days of being signed, that boards of elections will have to deal with possibly before the end of this year, depending on when the governor signs it. A piece of legislation that mandating that all boards of elections have to put shapefiles on their website, and that will go into effect 180 days after the governor signs it. That was a piece of legislation that was recently passed. A piece of legislation that was recently passed that we'll have to deal with this year once the governor signs it is legislation allowing us to deduce the intent of a voter if it is obvious on absentee ballots that may not have fallen within the strict guidelines that we have now. Maybe they put an X, but it's outside the circle. These are kind of things that might have thrown out an absentee ballot before. Now we will be allowed to count those absentee ballots if we can determine the intent of the voter and it is well known. That is something that we will have to deal with in these elections this year, if and when the governor signs that bill. Another thing that we will have to deal with. Now I get into the category of things that we will have to deal with next year. The biggest thing next year is the move from a 25-day registration deadline to a 10-day registration deadline. This was the constitutional minimum. New York State Constitution says the registration deadline is 10 days, but we've been operating on 25 days for several decades now. So we will be going to the 10-day deadline for registration changes going forward starting in January 1 of 2023. Also starting in January 1, 2023, the wrong church bill will take effect, where ballots that are cast, affidavit ballots that are cast at the wrong polling place will allow to be counted for the races that they're allowed to vote in, as long as the voter went to the polling place in the right county and also the right assembly district. So that's another major push for advocates, and that was a big win for them, and that will start next year as well. Also starting next year, boards of elections will have to follow the State Board of Elections guidelines for objections and specifications to petitions, and whether it's independent designating or certificate of nominations. For those of you in the know, when we're ruling on petitions, different boards around the state have different processes. Some of them have hearings, some of them don't. Some of them you have to certify mail, some of you don't, to serve it on the opponents. Now we will all be following the state board guidelines, and that will, if the governor signs that, that will go into effect for next year's elections. Also going into effect for next year's elections is that people of non-binary gender, can run for party offices. In New York, you had to have a male and female member running for state committee for Republicans and Democrats for every assembly district. Now, because of this new law, people who are non-binary can run for either of those positions, and they won't be excluded from public office. Another bill is that we will no longer exempt party offices from absentee voting. It used to be that if you were running a primary for a party committee, that you would not have an absentee ballot for that party committee, or the boards of elections did not have to do that. We will now have to do that. Different boards have done it different ways, but we have done it. The last 2 years we're going to have absentee ballots for that. By the way, the thing with the objections, the Onondaga County Board of Elections already has done that, because several years back we had a court case where this incongruity was brought up in the way we held our objections and hearings in the state board, and even though we were legally found that we were absolutely within our right to hold it a different way, and we did publicize our notices, we felt that because there was this confusion, that we would adopt the state board way of doing business. And it's been a benefit to our Onondaga County Board the last several years. It's really structured our boards of elections and our objection process. And then the other big piece of legislation, the John R. Lewis New York Voting Rights Act, one of the strongest voter protection acts in the country, was passed. But it's going to take several years for that act to get into place. Oh no, I forgot about one of the other things that happened, the 10-day voter registration. Oh no, I talked about that. I'm sorry. So the New York Voting Rights Act is a major piece of legislation. It's going to change the way school board elections are held. It's going to change the way regular elections are held. It's going to change the way boards of elections have to report whether we're changing polling places. But this is going to take several years to go into advance, because the Attorney General, who's going to be an arbiter of sorts on some of these decisions, she has to get staffed up, or he, and then notify the boards of elections that she is ready to start taking those cases. And then 1 year after she notifies is when that part of the bill will go into effect. Other parts of the bill won't go into effect for 3 years. So these are major pieces of legislation. Some of them may not seem like that, but they're all pro-voter pieces of legislation that is going to make it easier to register to vote, easier to have your absentee ballot counted, and also make it easier, more information for the average voter from boards of elections on their polling places, and keep more voter protections in place. These are all great things. So I don't, David asked in the chat, what's the biggest win of legislation? It's going to be the New York Voting Rights Act. That's a win for voters. It's a huge seminal piece of legislation that is really going to change the way New York operates in the future and allow for easier paths for boards of elections to have to justify some of their decisions. So that's a major piece for voters. And so let's get into the things that did not get passed. There's a lot of stuff that was left on the table by this legislature. One of which is a restarting of the constitutional effort for a no-excuse absentee option. As you may recall, it did fail at the ballot box on last year, and many advocates and lawmakers said that they were going to put it back and have it on the ballot for the 2024 elections, the presidential primary. But because the legislature failed to act on this information, then the earliest this could get voted on now is 2025, and if they wanted to wait for an even year, it'll be 2026. So starting next year, absentee ballots will go back to being a fully excuse-able system of voting in New York. The pandemic excuse is set to expire at the end of this year, so that means that people will have to affirm that they are either permanently or temporarily ill, out of the area, or several other reasons for getting an absentee. So that is a direct result of the failure at the ballot box for that option, and I guess the legislature felt like it wasn't time to restart that process. We'll see if they do so next year. Same-day registration was also not restarted, although I think the move to a 10-day registration is a way to do that without having same-day registration. I'm going to go more into that 10-day thing later after these elections, because I don't want people to think, that this option for the 10-day registration is this year. It won't be available till next year. It's still 25 days before the election this year. And so I'm going to focus on that for the rest of the year. And then in January, when we do what's new in elections for 2023, I'm sure that'll be a big part of that. Another thing that was left on the table is really any semblance of Board of Elections reform. Besides the New York Voting Rights Act, which is a big piece, but in the wake of the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk of how to give more resources to boards of elections, and also more responsibilities and obligations for boards of elections. A lot of those things, none of those things really passed both sessions. The New York Senate passed a lot of them. The New York Senate passed a bill that would require all elections commissioners to be full-time. The New York Senate passed a bill that would give minimum staffing requirements to all boards of elections. The New York Senate passed bills that would prohibit boards of elections, commissioners and employees from holding public office, that would have a minimum set of qualifications to be a boards of elections commissioner, that would have a conflict of interest rule for boards of elections, a hearing process for appointing boards of elections. They also passed reform bills for New York City Board of Elections, and they passed a mandatory training set and a removal for boards of elections commissioners by the State Board of Elections. All of that passed the Senate. None of that passed the Assembly. So a lot of this talk of Board of Elections reform in this session did not happen. And I'm actually pretty upset about that. I think that a lot of these bills would have given more work to me, and a lot of these bills would have given me more resources to get that work done. So I do think that we might be missing an opportunity here. But we'll have to see whether it'll be taken up next session or not. But unfortunately, the Senate passed it and the Assembly didn't. I mean, there was a lot of work done. So, as always, these bills will now have to be reintroduced next year because it's the end of a 2-year session. This legislature will no longer exist after January 1st. A new legislature will come in, and so all the bills from these last 2 years have to be reintroduced. So it's not just the fact that maybe we can vote on it in next year. A lot of these bills need to be redrafted and reintroduced. So it's a pretty big hit for people hoping for some more Board of Elections reform or electoral reform. So a lot of other stuff didn't quite make it. I know a lot of people had a big push about the hybrid voting machine ban. That did not get through. So, any redistricting reform did not get through. So there's a lot of stuff that didn't get through that is left on the table for the next legislature. David asked, could there be another special session to pass more election legislation? Special sessions are very rare in the New York State Legislature, even rarer when they are up for election in that same year. It would have to be deemed an emergency to have that special session, and it is not likely. So, Michael, you asked about judicial vacancies. I'm not sure what you're asking about there. If you're asking whether they added more judicial seats, they did not add more judicial seats. There was a rumor they were going to add more judicial seats, and they did not. Oh, you know what? One other bill that passed that's a big thing is a prohibition of the word independence for state party names. So that bill passed, and that's a big thing because, as you remember, for years New York had what was called the Independence Party, and that the way they got that name was they ran on the Reform Party and then decided to become the Independence Party of New York after they got their 50,000 votes, and then now they lost that 2 years ago. And I know they're trying to reestablish that line again this year. So if they are able to establish a line with enough votes, they won't be able to call it the Independence Party. So that's a big change as well. I actually have to run to a meeting here soon, so I'm going to be cutting this short. But there was one final question in the chat. Can I comment on the recent revelations that the Trump administration drafted an executive order to have U.S. Marshals and private armed mercenaries seize voting machines in Arizona? Well, I'm glad I'm not in Arizona. That's the first comment I have. Obviously, whether the federal government had constitutional authority to do that is very questionable. I don't think they did. I think any such executive order would have been elevated quickly to the Supreme Court, as we saw in that post-2020 election court cases. They did not win most of those court cases. So it's been, I doubt that they would have been able to get that, even in this highly conservative activist Supreme Court. So but it does show the danger of putting people in office that do not respect our democracy. They will use every tool they can to supplant the will of the voters with their own will. So it's very important to remember that when we're going to the polls, that we must elect people who put our democracy first, power second, and parties third. Those are the people that we should be electing on both sides of the aisle. But it does seem like one party has decided that at least the many of the figures in that party have decided that the democracy, the tenets of democracy, should bend to the will of their own power and party, and that is troubling, to say the least. So that's all I got today. Thank you very much for joining in with Commissioner Nakar. This week I'll be doing a Wonky Wednesday on Wednesday about I'll do a Wonky Wednesday on Onondaga County registration and the current states of registrations in Onondaga County. On Friday I will have a Zoom with Zarni, and I'll be talking to not sure who I'm talking to. I have to check my calendar on that. I will have a Zoom with Zarni, and we'll be talking to Bruce McBain, who's running for 126th Assembly. Another candidate interview. That's this Friday. I'll be recording that tomorrow, and I'll be recording that Thursday, and I'll be up on Friday. And then, of course, this Sunday, if I have time, I plan on doing a special Sunday Thoughts article going over all of the election bills that were passed this year in detail, with links to bills and my more detailed thoughts about each one of them and how they may affect elections in the future. So I'm hoping to have all that done for you this week while preparing for the elections as well. So take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.